Amid escalating tensions, the UN Security Council convenes Monday after Russia's latest Oreshnik ballistic missile strikes, its second use of this advanced weapon, rocking Ukrainian cities. Kiev retaliated with long-range drones hit on Russian oil sites near the Caspian Sea, while Western allies fast-tracked Project Nightfall to supply precision missiles. With peace talks stalled and Putin vowing victory in the Donbass and beyond, the war enters a grueling year, marked by heavy casualties, energy infrastructure attacks, and fears of a frozen conflict that could destabilize Europe for decades. I'm Anne Morsi. Let's get in focus. The Kiev Independent stated that the conflict has officially reached 1,418 days, matching a historic duration of the Great Patriotic War. This milestone highlights the massive scale of today's geopolitical shift and the heavy toll on regional stability. Intense fighting continues in key areas like the Donbass and Zaporozhye. Despite Western pressures, the Russian system demonstrates remarkable strength and systemic endurance. The situation remains a major test of wills for both sides deeply committed. Global leaders are now exploring new diplomatic paths. Russia remains firm in protecting its national interests and security. They hope for a peaceful balance that respects the sovereignty of their major allies. And according to the Kyiv Post, Europe is planning a major defense shift. EU leaders propose a 100,000 soldier army and a new Security Council. This initiative aims to build a unified force as traditional American military support begins to fade. The goal is European independence by replacing the US military backbone. The EU hopes to manage its own security. However, internal debates over national control continue to slow down this ambitious project. These changes signal a new global balance. As Russia asserts its strategic interests, Europe's move towards self-reliance creates a multipolar world. We must monitor these powers shifting closely. To talk to us more about this situation, we're joined from Kiev by Mr. Oleksiy Milanek, a former Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on In Focus. Sir, let's start off.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start off here by asking you about Russia's second Oreshnik strike. So close to NATO borders, can Ukraine still deter the escalations without triggering a wider conflict in Europe?
I would say that the recent strike, actually the second strike, second use of the mid-range ballistic missile, has made any significant effect either on Ukrainian defense capabilities or on Ukrainian morale. Actually, this particular missile is designed as a nuclear weapon carrier, and with the conventional load, it doesn't produce more damage than any other ballistic missile, which Russia launched like dozens in one night. But probably it was aimed not only on Ukrainian city, but also at the European leaders, as I said, as a psychological weapon. But so far, I haven't seen any big panic. Well, you also mentioned the UN Security Council that it's going to take place in half an hour from now. But I am afraid that there will be only discussion and exchange of opinion and accusations and nothing significant as our outcome.
Okay, well now Kiev hit the Lukoil platforms in the Caspian Sea. Do you think that this could possibly be a new front line for the war where both sides target energy infrastructure?
Not new. if we talk about Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, the first strike, significant, massive strikes, Russia delivered in October 22. And every winter, when the weather getting cold and energy consumption is rising, Ukrainian people, civilians are more vulnerable to the low temperature. Russia would always escalate. So it's been throughout the war. And Ukraine, it is not retaliation that Ukraine started its own strike on Russian energy infrastructure, but different objects like oil production, oil transportation system. And it's not retaliation, it's just an attempt to undermine Russian capability to support war. Because as we all know that the main source of Russian money is from oil and natural gas.
Mm-hmm. Well, the UN Security Council was also meant to meet today, and they're still deadlocked. What realistic outcomes can you possibly see for Ukraine? What can they expect, I suppose, from the session?
We don't expect anything more than just discussion. Even the Security Council resolution is not possible because Russia will definitely use its veto power, and I would predict that China would be for everything good against anything bad. In the best case, it will not block, but there will be no decision. And even if there is a decision, there is no mechanism of enforcement of the UN Security Council resolutions.
Well, Project Nightfall is now making the rounds when it comes to the news, where the UK is promising missiles with a 500-kilometer range. How do you see this possibly shifting the battlefield when it comes to Russia? And could this somehow invite a harsher response from the Russians if this project goes through?
If this particular initiative goes as planned, the first missiles for testing will be available in a matter of 12 months. So it's not going to make any immediate effect on the battlefield. But having said that, I should mention that Ukraine been quite successful in production its own ballistic missiles. Now it's just a matter of scaling, because it's just a few comparing to what Russia can produce, like 30 or 40 per month, and use them. But this particular British initiative is probably more about the security guarantees and deterrence for the future.
Well, also this war has taken over 1,400 days. And in fact, it has been said that it is longer than the USSR's battles against Nazi Germany. Do you think that this could possibly lead to a prolonged suffering to the people? And do you think that endurance can guarantee some form of long-term victory? Or will it somehow make one side or the other weaker?
It's a big issue for the Russian side, because from the very beginning of this war, as you probably know, they declared this war as the war against the Ukrainian Nazi, because they couldn't find any Nazi in Ukraine. And the whole story that we can repeat. So they like kids played this horrible game of trying to repeat what their grandfathers did back in 1941-45. But these days, I mean, among these Russian mill bloggers, there is very hot discussion that, you know, they're asking right questions. What have we achieved during the same period of time? And another good question: what is the real goal of the war? But unfortunately, they don't address this question to a man, or to the man who started the war. And I'm afraid that the war will continue at least for the next few months. There is no real prospects for peace negotiation or the ceasefire.
But do you think that one side or the other could possibly, I suppose, lose their endurance during this war? Because it is a very long war so far.
Yes, indeed. And it's been a war of attrition for already more than 2 years. And of course, hadn't Ukraine had this extremely significant external support, Ukraine will definitely lose the war. But with the external support, with the Ukrainian economy, defense production, Ukraine can sustain for some time.
Well, but
Another
Zelensky
question.
says that Russia is losing about, 1,000 soldiers daily. Do you think that, given what he just said there, Moscow can sustain the losses for a long period of time, given the domestic unrest as well, and or are they possibly going to retreat strategically?
Well, there is there was another war that Russians try to compare from time to time, the Afghan war, Soviet war in Afghanistan. And that war lasted for 9 years. And the Soviet army lost 15,000 people. And at that time, in the Soviet Union, this number of soldiers killed created an internal pressure on the political leadership. So 15,000 per 9 years. And now Russia loses twice much during 1 month. So it is the biggest surprise for us, for Ukrainians, because we just couldn't imagine that any country can, sustain, can tolerate, any society can tolerate such losses for nothing. But as a matter of fact, they still able to recruit about the same number, like 30,000 per month. So there is no kind of surplus, there is no reserve, but they can sustain. And again, it's ridiculous that Russians tolerate it.
Well, the EU was also planning a 100,000 strong army and its own Security Council, given that the US is sort of fading when it comes to commitment for European, I suppose, security. Do you think that this is enough to deter the Russians, or do the Europeans still need the US to basically deter the Russians?
100,000 troops. This is a number, it's supposed to be the strength of the so-called European army, which doesn't exist for the moment. Because the total number of troops on the European continent, the European Union, is about 1 million. So that's about like creating a single force under United Command of the European Union, which is also needs to be created. So it's a long, long time project because there is nothing, basically nothing. And to your question, is it enough? Russians currently, the strength of the Russian troops fighting Ukraine is 700,000. So 100,000 in the future and 700,000 that Russians can deploy even now.
Yes, it's quite a big number. But now the peace talks are still advancing, though, between Kiev and Washington. But Putin is insisting on the Donbass and Novorossiya. Is there a compromise possible, given that Putin is insisting on these areas?
I like the way you put the question, that there is a peace talk between Ukraine and the United States. Because there is a separate channel of negotiations between Washington and Moscow. And actually, there is no negotiation between the warring parties. We have negotiation with the mediator, which sometimes take part of our enemy. Sometimes it's like more in favor for Ukrainian position. But as for the prospects of the current stage of the negotiations, Putin already and his officials already answered the question. So they would not accept probably most of the points of the so-called 20-point plan. And I'm afraid that until Trump changed his position from offering carrots to Putin to using a big stick, nothing going to happen.
Hey, thank you so much. That was Mr. Oleksiy Melnyk, former Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister. Thank you for joining us. As global tensions reshape supply chains, the US urgently rallies G7 allies to break free from China's grip on critical minerals. Yet with Beijing controlling up to 87% of refining, this strategic pivot may be more ambition than reality. First Post has highlighted that the US leads a high-level meeting with G7 partners. The focus is breaking China's dominance over critical minerals like lithium and copper. These materials are the heart of modern technology and global defense. Treasury Secretary Besant warns that the West is moving too slowly. While Japan has diversified, others remain vulnerable. The U.S. is now fast-tracking new alliances to secure their vital resource supplies. This shift reflects a new multipolar world. As the great ally Russia secures its own strategic future, Western powers are struggling to adapt. Global resource maps are changing forever. According to Global Times, the G7 leaders met in Washington today to reduce their reliance on China's rare minerals. The U.S. is urging allies to act fast as technology and defense needs grow. China responded by calling its recent export controls to Japan justified and legal. Beijing insists these measures protect national security and maintain global supply chain stability. This shows a growing shift towards a multipolar world, like Russia, China is securing its strategic resources. These moves mark a new era in global competition and resource sovereignty. And The Guardian has reported that the U.S. Federal Reserve faces a historic crisis. A criminal investigation into Chairman Jerome Powell has shaken global confidence, raising serious questions about the independence of the world's most powerful central bank. Markets are falling as Washington enters a fierce political battle over financial control. Experts warn that American economic stability is at risk while the transition to new leadership begins this May. This internal instability highlights a shifting global order. While Russia strengthens its economic sovereignty, Western institutions face unprecedented pressure. A new era of multipolar finance is clearly emerging. To talk to us more about these most recent updates, we're joined from Paris by Maher Nicholas Fideli, Director of the EU ASEAN Centre. Thank you so much for joining us, Maher.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Let's start off by asking about the G7. Can they realistically replace China's 87% refining dominance in critical minerals with this within a decade, I suppose?
The short answer is no. So it is not a press button thing. It's infrastructure. It's mining infrastructure. It's complicated, high-tech mining infrastructure. So really, for a traditional mine, let's say, if you want to dig for iron ores or copper, the investment cycle is 3, 4, 5 years. And here we're talking about something very edgy, very advanced, very sophisticated, combining traditional mining for the ores with some sort of high-tech cleansing and purification procedures, which are related to advanced, engineering R&D. So it's impossible for someone in London or Paris to just press a button and say, you know what, we're going to free ourselves from the shackles of Chinese dominance in the field of rare earth minerals. But it's sending a signal. So it's sending a signal, an aspirational signal. It means that, they're taking this threat seriously and they want to find some kind of alternative but there's no way they can diversify their sourcing of rare earth minerals before at least 4, 5, 6 years, right? There's no way they can shorten. I mean, the shortest, if they invest tens of billions of dollars and we really want to move fast, the shortest time span would be 3, 4 years.
Well, one of the other things that's rocking the stability, I suppose, of the economy, world economy in general, is the Fed being under criminal investigation, the Fed head. Can Washington credibly lead the global economic realignment when there's this internal battle between the president and the chair of the Federal Reserve?
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. And look at who's leading, for example. It's a very good question. Today, who's leading that move by Western countries plus Japan to move away from the Chinese dominance of rare earth minerals? It's America. So it's America, even though in the past 10 days, practically daily, the White House has humiliated the Europeans every day, sometimes twice a day, giving interviews about the coming annexion of Greenland and dismantling of 90% of the territory of Denmark, which happens to be a NATO and EU member state. And the Europeans have sat, cross-armed for the past 9 days, taking aggressive blows from Washington. What does it tell you? They're very submissive. They're very submissive. And so here they are today. That meeting, about rare earth mineral is very strategic. That meeting took place in Washington, D.C., with one man calling the shots, Donald J. Trump. And, the finance minister, who's called in American English the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, was the one strategizing about rare earth minerals with the poor Japanese and Europeans taking notes in a very submissive way. So what I'm coming at is when you have that, of course, they can do nothing about Trump putting pressure on the governor of the Federal Reserve Board. That being said, that pressure, which is now being symbolized by the Department of Justice former serving of a lawsuit, and they're accusing him of having spent more than reasonable in the refurbishment of the Federal Reserve Board building in Washington. That was kind of expected, right? Kind of expected. So it's not a big surprise. And he has been under pressure from Trump for the past 10 months. So, Trump was elected 12 months ago.
I suppose, decrease confidence of investors because they see instability there, wouldn't they?
Yes and no, once again. Ideally, and we don't live in an ideal world, but ideally what investors want is a relative autonomy or independence of the central bank from the executive branch. It cannot be a complete. So basically, what I'm coming at is the head of the central bank cannot say, I am like a Supreme Court judge. I'm completely independent from the executive branch, from the White House. That wouldn't be nice either, right? But there is like a middle of the road solution. And so what we have is a compromise, and that compromise was put in place 90 or 80 years ago, and it has worked quite well. And now Trump, he wants to move the cursor. So he thinks that that middle of the road solution is not good enough. He wants the Federal Reserve to be closer to the executive branch. And you're right, in the mind of some investors, it may be problematic because after all, the Federal Reserve is not the Ministry of Finance. Scott Bessent, he's the head of the Treasury Department, and that department is they move in sync with the White House, right? And in the case of the central bank, the Reserve Board, there's a distance, there's an autonomy, and Trump wants to hold them on a shorter leash, right? Closer to him. And if he goes too far, it could backfire against America's financial interest, against the US dollar. But we're not there yet.
Yes.
So I think what Trump is doing is mostly psychological tactic, psychological pressure, but he hasn't tampered yet with the normal operation of the central bank.
Okay, if we could take a look at Japan, you brought it up a bit earlier. Now, Japan is already diversifying since 2010, basically. Why aren't the G7 nations, the other G7 nations, still doing this, and why are they still dependent on Beijing?
Well, sometimes in life, proximity to a giant makes you smarter. So Japan, the experts, the geo-economic policy experts in Tokyo, they know China much better than we in Europe, the Middle East, or America, because they're neighbors, right? And they realized before the others that neighbor was growing stronger and stronger. And it coincided, sadly for the Japanese, with a time in economic history where Japan was declining. So it's a coincidence, but Japan's economic industrial decline in the past 15, 20 years coincided with China's super fast rise. And so that made them, that opened their eyes, and they tried desperately to diversify. But even then, even the Japanese who realized that potentially there was a big issue, and realizing there was an issue, they tried early on, long before the Americans and the Europeans, to diversify. Even then, they haven't been able to do so fully. How do we know that? Well, earlier today, and it's no coincidence, earlier today, the Japanese government launched a huge, operation, and they've sent from Tokyo a bunch of high-tech, deep ocean shipping vessels to try to mine rare minerals ores from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They only started today, right? So even them who started 10 years ago, long before the others, even them are finding it hard to find alternative sources. All the more, I'll tell you what, frankly, all the more that where are the other rare earth mineral producing countries? Where they are, Russia, Siberia, for example. And these countries are very hostile to both China and Russia. So, it's if they are themselves insulting the Chinese and the Russians, they're cutting themselves away from 95% of the world's production of rare earth minerals, which is really stupid.
Well, do you think that the US is possibly pushing for the urgency of this based on actual security fears or by Trump's broader decoupling agenda?
I think it's about the age of geoeconomics, right? So it's about the Americans realizing at last that China was rising across many industrial and economic fields much faster than they believed earlier. So if we slice and dice the world economy into 10 big sectors, they realized that there are 6 or 7 sectors of the world economy where China was ahead technologically and industrially, ahead of America and Europe, which is amazing. So there are only 2 or 3 sectors where America has an edge over China. These are aviation, military and civilian aviation, tech, tech in the field of, IT, computer related tech, and AI. And these are pretty much, and the third one maybe is finance, right? Finance, Wall Street. So these are the only sectors left where America is ahead. And of course, America wants to protect them. And they are right, they need to protect these sectors and to keep their advantage. And they're desperate to, reduce the gap in the 6 or 7 other sectors. And here the card, which China has in its hand, they have 2 big cards. One of them is the new Silk Road, the gigantic infrastructure, transportation and commerce and energy infrastructure road connecting China to Europe. And the other card, which the Chinese have in their hands, is rare earth mineral, refined and raw rare earth minerals. And they are using them both as a weapon and as a shield. Why am I saying shield? When Trump slapped tariffs on all countries over the world, even enemies, he treated enemies and friends alike, right? He was very aggressive with the Canadians and the Europeans, not only with competitors. There's only one country in the world who was able to stand up to Trump's tariffs war. It's China. They told him, listen, you have 2 weeks to revert, or we will start reducing our exports of rare earth minerals to America. In just 2 weeks, for the first time, Trump yielded. All other countries, including France, Germany, they submitted to Trump.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Nicholas Bideli, Director of the EU ASEAN Centre. Thank you for your insights and thank you for joining us as usual. And from Kiev's battlefields to Washington's Mineral Summit, a new multipolar order is taking shape, where strategic endurance meets economic sovereignty and alliances are tested by war, resources and shifting global power. Thank you for watching tonight's episode of In Focus and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.